From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. A bizarre turn of events is unfolding at La Picota Prison in Bogota, Colombia. FARC leader Jesus Santrich has been arrested again just minutes after being freed. It's believed Santrich is now being flown via helicopter to the Attorney General's head offices. Santrich was actually brought out of the prison in a wheelchair surrounded by police. Then about 2 minutes later, he was wheeled back through the prison gates. The Attorney General's office now claims authorities have uncovered new evidence showing that the drug trafficking crime Santrich is accused of took place after the peace agreements were signed, meaning he can be prosecuted for those alleged crimes in the United States. Earlier in the day, Santrich was seriously wounded but is reportedly in stable condition. No further details have been released about the incident either. Soon after news broke about the injuries, Bogota's Regional Supreme Court ordered that Santrich be released immediately. And all this comes just 2 days after the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the court dealing with Colombia's peace process, turned down the U.S. extradition request. The GEP ordered his immediate release, but despite protests inside and outside the Picota Prison where Santrich is being held, the authorities had refused to do so. And President Iván Duque strongly criticized the order to release Santrich, and the leader of Duque's party, former President Álvaro Uribe, says the FARC leader will be extradited.
Colombian Justice, the Attorney General's office, the judges who requested Santrich's extradition have already proven the crimes were committed after the peace accords were signed. He must be extradited. Within our party, we know that President Duque is making the right decision in accordance with our laws. In the end, Jesus Santrich will be extradited.
Moving on, the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza has confirmed that the first steps of dialogue with the opposition have been taking place in Norway. He said the talks in Oslo were good news for everyone and had caused the so-called Lima Group to suspend its next meeting. Arreaza was talking in an exclusive interview with Telesur.
We are very grateful to the Kingdom of Norway, to their government and their foreign ministry. We are grateful for the work done here in Caracas between both sides, and for the work being done in Oslo. Both sides have come together. This is really good news, and we must highlight that, because dialogue and respect for democracy are good news. This is the only way we can find a solution to our current political situation. What we are seeing in Venezuela is an ongoing historical conflict, and we must be able to handle it with respect. Respect for the Bolivarian Constitution and for our institutions, with respect for Venezuela's sovereignty and guaranteeing peace in our nation.
Minister Arreaza also highlighted that Venezuelan authorities have been pushing for dialogue with the U.S. government, adding that their strategy to besiege Venezuela have so far failed.
We hope that the U.S. understands our stance. We have sent messages to them saying that diplomacy must be respected. We have said this to Mike Pompeo, to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. We've told him that it's time to restart diplomacy. All their strategies have failed. They are trapped in a maze with no exit. They have been stumbling over and over again. We are ready and willing to have talks, to sit down and reestablish respect.
And Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro has met with representatives of the International Contact Group as part of his government's efforts to advance a dialogue with the Venezuelan opposition. The Contact Group also held meetings with various political parties and diplomats in the Foreign Ministry in Caracas. They discussed international law and sovereignty and talked about setting up a dialogue and how to pressure the United States to lift unilateral sanctions against Venezuela. The International Contact Group is made up of the European Union, Ecuador, and Costa Rica, among others. A judge has approved the release of the 4 activists who were arrested after being removed from the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. On Twitter, journalist Alex Rubinstein reports that they will be released today. He also says each activist was charged with 1 class of misdemeanor of interfering with a federal law enforcement agent engaged in protective functions. The charge carries a maximum of 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine. Their next court date is June 12th. And earlier on Friday, electricity was restored to the building of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. The lights were switched on hours after the Metropolitan Police invaded the diplomatic premises and took away members of the Embassy Protection Collective who were inside. Last Thursday, the electricity was cut while water was shut off 2 days later in an attempt to smoke out those defending the rights of the government of Venezuela. Teachers and health workers in Honduras have continued their protests against the privatization of public education and healthcare. Our correspondent in Tegucigalpa, Gilda Silvestrucci, has more.
Teachers and doctors are continuing their protests this Friday in case the government attempts to reduce their labor rights and gains, including the retirement age. They are also protesting against the attempt to privatize both public education and the healthcare system, in line with demands by the International Monetary Fund. This was part of an agreement which President Juan Orlando Hernández signed recently for the IMF to provide $311 million. As part of their protests, they have been holding assemblies and suspended non-essential care for patients as well as classes across the country.
We thank Gilda for that report. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of Brazilian Bishop Wilson Dias de Oliveira. The bishop is reportedly under investigation for alleged extortion and covering up sexual abuse. In April, he also admitted to police he had taken $4,000 from church funds for personal use, claiming he was having financial difficulties. Pope Francis passed a decree this month making it mandatory for clerics to report sexual abuse. In 2017, the wider Caribbean region, including Puerto Rico and Cuba, suffered over $98 billion in damage caused by storms. The startling statistic was revealed at the 19th meeting of the Monitoring Committee of the Caribbean Development and Cooperation Committee. Caribbean diplomats attending the meeting underway in Trinidad and Tobago are discussing ways of reposition vulnerable, highly indebted small island developing states in the face of these natural disasters.
For the Caribbean, we estimate costs in excess of $7 billion. But when we add Puerto Rico and Cuba, it takes us to about $98 billion, of which Cuba was $13 billion and Puerto Rico about $68 billion. These are enormous sums of money in a region in which access to concessional finance has been in decline.
Another serious challenge facing the Caribbean region is low economic growth and stubbornly high debt amid difficult IMF adjustments. The issue also underpinned discussions at EDLAC's Monitoring Committee meeting.
The international environment has not been very supportive. As you know, commodity prices have not been very good. And countries like Trinidad and Tobago, for example, depend heavily on hydrocarbon, have suffered as a consequence. And more generally, tourism economies, which were not doing as well, are doing a little better now. So overall, the performance of the region has moved up a little, but as I say, growth is anemic. A big part of the problem of low growth has to do with the declining exports. Export capacity in the region has been on decline. And if you look at the two periods, 2000 and up to 2010 and 2010 to 2015, you see the difference. But also look at the Caribbean relative to other regions. We're doing very badly.
The European Union has removed Barbados, Bermuda, and Aruba from its blacklist of tax havens. The three Caribbean islands were blacklisted in March for failing to change their tax rules for months. Aruba has been removed completely because it has changed this legislation to make it compliant with EU requirements. Meanwhile, Barbados and Bermuda have committed to address the issue and been moved to a so-called grey list of countries still under EU scrutiny for their tax rules. Over a century later, the United States invasion still haunts the people of the Dominican Republic. It started in 1916 when U.S. Marines first arrived for an 8-year occupation.
Although 103 years have passed since the first U.S. military occupation when the U.S. flag was flown over the Ozama fortress, The people of the Dominican Republic will never forget what losing their sovereignty meant.
In 1916, invasion was due to a geopolitical juncture because of the United States expanding its efforts. The U.S. clearly has great interest in this Caribbean area. Haiti had also been invaded in 1915 and 1916, and so the U.S. decided to also intervene in the affairs of the Dominican Republic to retrieve all debts.
Mere days before the intervention, President Juan Isidro Jimenez had stepped down from his seat inside the fortress, which is now in ruins. He had been having problems with the United States and with his War Minister, Desiderio Arias.
He felt as though he had to quit, while still maintaining a dignified position, which at least will stand in time. Of course, he was able to visualize at that moment that sooner or later a wound would be inflicted upon the Dominican nation with the arrival of the troops to Santo Domingo, which finally took place on May 15, 1916.
Urbano Gilbert was among those who led the resistance against the United States intervention. Over a century later, the Dominican Congress has decided to recognize him as a national hero. His remains rest in a humble foss in the cemetery, but will soon be moved to the National Pantheon, where sovereignty is celebrated, as is the significant role women played in defending the country.
Although women were not citizens, they carried out a moral citizenship. They took to the streets where they organized and created the Patriotic Ladies Association, which collected money and raised their voice against the United States occupation.
During the occupation, roads and bridges were built to connect the provinces and also to make the existing sugar mills more profitable. The National Army was created. The period also saw the birth of the torrent system under which lands were legalized, but it was not in the best interest of the Dominican people. It was the U.S. owners who benefited as they significantly expanded their plantations. This no doubt shows that the United States has a history of strategic interference in Latin America and the Caribbean, which still goes on today.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. Police in Algeria have fired tear gas canisters at protesters as tens of thousands of them returned to the streets of Algiers for the 13th successive Friday. The protesters are demanding widespread political reforms and the removal of all officials belonging to former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government. Police have heavily repressed protesters at the Central Post Office as they attempt to block the area to demonstrators.
They want to destroy us, but they won't in God's will. We say they all live, and that means they all live, not to tell stories of revenge. We are the ones who choose who represent us and not them.
Protesters in Sudan have cleared roadblocks following an army decision to suspend talks on installing civilian rule. On Thursday, the chief of Sudan's ruling military council announced the talks had been suspended for 72 hours due to what he says deteriorating security. He also demanded that protesters dismantle barricades, open bridges, and railway lines connected. Protesters said the army was trying to provoke them by delaying the negotiations.
We have removed the bricks according to an agreement and they have given 3 days. And if our demand is made yes, we leave the bricks. But if they do not respond to our demands, then we will bring the bricks back again. And we hope that it will remain as our symbol, to stand for a peaceful demonstration to achieve one's goal of freedom, peace and order. And the demonstration is the right of the youth.
Just over 2 months after Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique, displacing over 1,000 people and destroying a number of towns and villages, restoration efforts continue. Our correspondent, Andre Vieira, traveled to Mozambique along with Cuban medical personnel who are there to help those affected by the storm. He has more details in this report.
We are in the city of Beira, in Mozambique, with the Henry Reed Brigade, made up of Cuban medical personnel, who have been working here for 48 days to provide healthcare to the victims of Storm Idai. These Cuban doctors have treated more than 20,000 people and have performed around 300 surgeries. They are also treating people who come in on a daily basis to this place, which is functioning as a hospital. Citizens tell us they are glad for the aid being offered. We also spoke to the Cuban doctors who have been around the world performing similar humanitarian acts, and they said that they have not only brought healthcare, but also happiness and smiles to those affected by Idai.
We thank Andre for that report. Zambia's President Edgar Lungu has challenged mining companies that are unhappy with the government policies to leave the country. The government wants to replace the value-added tax with a sales tax. Mining firms are not in agreement and have threatened to cut down on the number of employees. Lungu also says he is consulting with his Attorney General on ways of disengaging mining firms that have been exploiting Zambians.
Thank you very much for coming to the aid of the miners and for coming to the aid of the copper belt, so that we can now look for another investor who come and replace KCM. And this also will send a signal to any mining company that you misbehave in terms of not fulfilling what their mandate at the time they took over the mines.
A court in Kenya has found former President Daniel Arap Moi guilty of land grabbing. Moi, who ruled from 1978 and 2002, has been ordered to pay $10 million to the rightful owners of property he illegally sold to a timber firm in 2007. His lawyers claimed the land was his to sell. However, the judge upheld a claim from the family of a now deceased local chief who accused Moi of abusing his position to seize the property from him in 1983. A villa in Misrata, Libya has turned into a hive of activity as mothers prepare food parcels with messages for sons battling on the outskirts of the capital. More than 10,000 food parcels are being sent each day 200 kilometers away to the front for the UN-recognized fighters in south of Tripoli. Around 100 women work in 2-day shifts.
For our sons and for the sake of the nation, we are ready to pay a dear price for the homeland, and for Misrata especially, because it gave us a lot of, and it is our duty to give back, even if it's a small part of what our children have given us and what this good country has given us.
The Rwanda Investigation Bureau has paraded before the media a leading member of a rebel movement. Calix Sabimana is accused of acts of terrorism and he faces life imprisonment in line with the country's new terrorism law. Sabimana, the spokesman for National Liberation Front, appeared in public for the first time since he was captured in Comoros on April 13th and secretly handed to Rwandan authorities. He has previously declared war on the Rwandan government. The German Historical Museum has announced it will return a 15th century monument to Namibia after it was taken during the colonial era. The stone cross is a Portuguese navigation landmark that was placed on the southwest African coastline in 1486. But when the area was under German colonial control in the 1890s, the cross was taken and moved to Europe. Namibia asked for its return in 2017, and on Friday, the Berlin Museum formally agreed to the request. Germany has also pledged to return artifacts and human remains to its former colonies. Thousands of Palestinians in the occupied East Jerusalem have participated in prayers of the second Friday of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The prayers took place under intense security measures by Israeli security forces. Men over 40, children under 13, and women of all ages are allowed to enter East Jerusalem without permits for the Friday prayers. Men under 40, however, are banned. The Al-Aqsa Mosque compound is the third holiest site in Islam. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. May 17th marks the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. And marking the day, Taiwan has become the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. Taiwanese lawmakers passed a law allowing same-sex couples to form exclusive permanent unions and be able to apply for a marriage registration. Hundreds of LGBTQ activists gathered outside Taipei's parliament as a legislative debate got underway over the bill. In recent months, conservative and Christian groups had been advocating for the bill to be dropped and instead pass a legalization that offers something closer to limited same-sex unions.
Today is a very significant day to us because we could finally pass a law that could protect my family. We've been fighting for this change since for 5 years for me personally, before I even had children, and now that I do, it means even more.
The French city of Bordeaux has unveiled a rainbow-colored pedestrian crossing to mark International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. The crossing was created as a symbol of the fight against discrimination and to promote awareness of the struggle the LGBTQ community places in public spaces. A recent study of the LGBTQI community shows that 83% of them have suffered discrimination or aggressions in the last year.
This new pedestrian crossing is a symbol of inclusion, of the fight against discrimination and of the fight against homophobia and transphobia. To say that everyone has a place in public spaces, whatever their sexual orientation or gender identity.
And finally, Spanish LGBTQI organizations are reporting a crisis in a country that once was a pioneer in the defense of LGBTQI rights.
According to a survey by international organization ILGA, Spain is no longer part of the 10 European countries that are more respectful with LGBTI rights. The country used to hold second place back in 2011. Now a lack of national laws and the decision to force trans people to take a psychiatric diagnosis have put the country much lower in the list.
For instance, we need to ban therapies that allegedly cure homosexuality. You can find them in half of the regions, and there is not punishment for such horrible therapies.
After 7 years without any new legislation, advances or sanctions to protect the community, Spain is living a huge crisis according to some organizations.
The main proposal is the approval of a specific law to defend the LGBT community and also specific laws for trans people, so we can amend all the discriminations in our country.
According to the National LGBTI Federation, homophobia, biphobia and transphobia have been normalized in Spain, and between 60 and 80% of cases are not reported. Maribel suffered one of those crimes.
Two individuals came close to me, and when they realized I'm trans, they attacked me, saying "you're a fag," and punched me, leaving me lying on the floor.
Besides social abuse, the trans community suffer labor, education and health discriminations.
If I'm not recognized within the system, what are my rights? What happens if, as a woman, I suffer a sexist attack because of my gender? What happens if I have to go to jail? Which jail? What happens if I have to go to a healthcare center or a hospital?
LGBT groups demand that May 17 be a celebration day to commemorate the progress made until now, but also as a day to demand real equality.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.